Welcome to the Aaron Harber Show. My special guest today from New York University, Professor Stephen Koonin. Steve, thanks for joining me.
Great to chat with you, Aaron.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. You're a professor of so many different things: information operations, management science, civil and urban engineering. And of course,
Physics, my home discipline.
And let's not forget, you were the founding director of NYU's Center for Urban Science and Progress. Right. You were the Undersecretary for Science in the U.S. Department of Energy.
That's right, first Obama.
So, very impressive resume. I'm honored that you're here.
It's great to be talking with you again.
Well, a pleasure. And for full disclosure, you're on my National Sustainability Council.
I am indeed.
So we're trying to model for the Earth how we can build efficiently from a perspective of minimizing energy consumption, water consumption, and hopefully someday that will happen. But
right, it's going to be a while.
Yeah, don't hold your breath. So I want to start off with, one of the things you've done, and I've been reading everything that you do that gets published, by the way, in the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
They're being very kind to you, by the way. I'm sure they're paying you a lot of money.
Oh, yeah, right. A couple $100 a piece, perhaps.
You're still ahead of me.
Yeah.
I'd like your take on, are we having honest conversations about climate science or not?
No, I don't think we are, actually. To use the British phrase, I think they have over-egged the custard in terms of the certainty and magnitude of the threats. What we decide to do about growing human influences on the climate means we have to build a balance between the risks and the benefits of providing energy that still emits CO2. There are 3 billion people in the world who don't have enough energy, and I've not heard yet anyone who advocates reducing emissions rapidly give me an answer to what are you going to do about those 3 billion people?
And 1 billion of them don't even have electricity.
Absolutely. Right.
And so, that's one of the things that intrigues me, that I'm an environmentalist. I'm very concerned about climate change. But among my colleagues, what I don't hear is how do we address the needs of those people at the bottom of the pyramid, where we have our cars, we have our homes, we have electricity that's very reliable, yet we want to impose restrictions that keep 1 billion, or using your number, 3 billion people down. There's something very arrogant about that. There's something very elitist about that. It's like, we have ours, you're not going to get yours.
Right. Anthony Downs was a pioneering social scientist writing in the 1970s about air pollution at the time. He was at Brookings. And he wrote something that sticks in my mind, that the elite's environmental degradation is the common man just improving his lot. And so many people, including Alex Epstein, have pointed out that it is immoral not to give those several billion people the energy that they need to improve their lot. It's not the population that's going to drive a 50% increase in energy over the next 30 years. It is the development, the economic benefit, light, mobility, refrigeration, all of the things that we take for granted in a developed society.
So, how do we have more honest discussions about climate change? But I also, certainly I'm concerned about issues such as sea level rise. Can we have any impact on that? Is it too late? Have we passed the tipping point? Things like that. But start off with, how can we have more honest discussions about climate change and climate science?
Science, right. And what is the climate doing and what is it likely to do? I think we need to improve climate literacy together with energy literacy. That's a different issue. But climate literacy, I wrote a book which is an attempt to provide climate literacy. What I did was to take material that's in the official reports, whether by the UN, IPCC, or by the US government, and make it accessible to people. Those reports are thousands of pages. They're very dense. If you can take the same material and, of course, cite the references, but make it accessible, then people can start to get a sense of what we know and what we don't know. I've been compared occasionally to William Tyndall, Now, I didn't know who William Tyndall was. I had to look him up. He was a guy in the early 16th century who translated the Bible from Greek and Hebrew into English, making it accessible. It was the forerunner of King James. And he got in big trouble for doing that, was eventually burned at the stake. And I hope that doesn't happen to me. But, people need to understand. Let's start with that as a premise, not persuade them, but just get them to understand.
Is there a way to have more commonality in terms of sources that most, if not all of us, consider reliable? One of the issues today in political discourse is we're often not arguing about the same facts. We're not even being selective about what facts we're debating or using. We're making up facts. Different sides just are fabricating evidence, and that certainly makes any kind of reasoned discussion very difficult.
Right. So my touchstone when I talk about these things is the primary data, acknowledged from official resources, the research literature, and the UN assessment reports. The science, as some of the politicians talk about it. And all you have to do is cut through the fog that's sometimes in those reports and say, here's the data. Let me give you an example, okay? I published about 3 weeks ago a piece in the Wall Street Journal about how fast Greenland is shrinking, the ice.
Right.
All right? And they were kind enough to let me show a graph of the official data.
Which is rare,
Which
by
is
the way.
rare, right? That's one of the
For
problems.
the Wall Street Journal.
Right? Now, though they show stock graphs all the time, it's not so different. And what you see is that contrary to the media alarm that Greenland is melting faster and faster, yeah, it did melt faster from 1990 until almost the present, but it did the same thing 80 years ago when human influences were much smaller. It goes up and down and up and down, and it says in the papers, which I cited in the article, that this is due to basically weather in the North Atlantic and the cycles it undergoes.
So are you concerned at all that those cycles may become accelerated, or the period of time of melting will be expanded? So you still would have cycles, but certain aspects of them would be longer.
And in fact, I said in the article, it may well be that it's going to take some number of decades until we see the warming have an effect. But the research papers say, it's going to be several decades at least, all right? So, but what I'm most upset about is that the media take a short-term thing and blow it up into something having to do with human influence on the climate when it's demonstrably not that.
All right, now in terms of that, obviously the media also struggles with a number of challenges in terms of who's reporting, how much science background they have, their ability...
Limited time.
Right,
Yeah.
Their ability to understand, their desire to provide material information to the public in a manner that's intelligible to their readers, to their viewers, to their listeners. What about the concept, and you've mentioned this before, of kind of the telephone game, which we're all familiar with. Talk about a little bit about it.
I'll turn to the telephone in a minute. I want to say one more thing about the media. Apart from the constraints of expertise and time and who do you believe and so on, some of the media, in fact, many of the major outlets, have joined an organization called Covering Climate Now. And their pledge is not to pledge anything that disagrees with the narrative. So you find Scientific American, parts of BBC, parts of NPR, basically saying we're not going to publish anything that reduces the alarm. And to me, that's pretty bad journalism, okay?
That's not scientific.
No, that's not science at all. It's not even good reporting, I would argue. So let's talk about the game of telephone, right? There is an underlying reality to the science, what we know, what we don't know, what we think might be happening. You find it in the research papers which draw upon the data and the models. You need to be an expert to read those papers. And even I, as a physics background, it took me some number of years until I could really understand it and put the pieces together. Those research papers get assessed periodically by the UN every 6 or 7 years, by the US government every 4 years, and meant to synthesize and package the science for the experts and summarize it for non-experts. And then you go to those summaries, and then you go to the media, and then you go to the political and popular discussions. And there is ample opportunity along that game of telephone to distort the message, leave out some things, overemphasize others, and so on. And so what the public hears in the end is not really what the science says.
That's a huge challenge. I have to admit, I usually stop at the abstract.
Yeah.
So, but that's probably more than most.
Right.
At least I'm looking at the paper. What are some popular myths when it comes to
some of the surprising things you find in the reports, right, and in the data, that there's hardly anything happening with hurricanes over the last century. Up until a year or two ago, people would say there's nothing happening. And in the last year, there was a paper published that said, well, maybe we're seeing a strengthening of the fraction of major storms. But then another paper came along and said, no, that's just a return to normal natural fluctuation. There's a lot of natural variability in the system, and you can fool yourself into thinking it's human caused when it's just a 20, 30-year trend. So hurricanes is one. Another is that heat waves are no more common now in the US than they were in 1900. They were pretty high in 1900, then the Dust Bowl hit and they got really high, then they went down and they've been slowly coming back up since about 1960. But we have seen this kind of weather before. Similarly, temperatures in Greenland were about as high in 1930 as they are today on the surface. And the one that really, I think, is a kind of bottom line is that the projected economic impact, either nationally or globally, of a warming of 4 or 5 degrees, remember Paris is about 1.5 degrees, would be a few percent, which is a couple years of growth. So we're talking about a delay in economic growth by 2 or 3 years, 70 years or 80 years from now. Nobody can project that accurately. And in fact, the IPCC says that climate is one of the smaller factors in determining economic well-being. Obviously, technology, trade, regulations, demographics are much more important. And when you point these out to people, they will say, I don't believe it, but you show them that's right there in the report. And they say, well, there are uncertainties and et cetera, et cetera. So there has been an over-exaggeration of the threat. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do something about it, but using the words existential or climate crisis is just unconscionable. So we need to cancel the climate crisis.
So how about when you look at climate impacts? I mean, certainly, one of the issues is if you look at the number of deaths, for example, due to climate, on a per capita basis, they've gone down.
A lot, yeah.
But that's also because we've adapted.
Right.
We're building, so it doesn't mean that climate's getting better, it's not as dangerous, it's we're using concrete, we're reinforcing structures.
We've got better warning systems, right? We can track hurricanes, for example.
Right, so that's a little that can be misleading. But how about the loss, for example, the loss of species, which I think concerns a lot of people, where, and you tell me if I'm wrong about the evidence, where for certain species, a relatively small increase in temperature in their environment can be devastating. Mm-hmm. For others have the ability to adapt rapidly. Some species take decades or centuries to adapt. Give me your take on that. And I love polar bears.
Yeah, and the polar bears are doing just fine, by the way, okay? The populations are way up, okay?
Well, I thought they were off on ice floes.
Yeah, right. No. You really
I'm going to put some footage in
to
data. Show on that.
Yeah, of course. Look, since 1900, the globe has warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius. In that time, we've seen the greatest increase in human welfare ever. We went from 2 billion people in 1900 to just about 8 billion people today, so 4 times, and we've seen spectacular advances in nutrition, health, longevity, education, et cetera, et cetera. To think that another 1.1, 1.5 degrees over the next century is going to significantly derail that beggars belief. all right?
That you're talking about the population growth and the welfare of people.
That's right. The ecosystems, they've also seen a 1.1 degree rise, more on the land, less in the ocean, more on the poles and so on. And, I'm not an expert in ecology. Some are doing fine, some will have to adapt, but that's what living things do. What we get wrong, I think, is to look at these short-term changes and raise alarm. So the Great Barrier Reef, for example, 5-10 years ago, you heard a lot of alarm about that. That alarm has gone down a lot because, in fact, the reef is recovering just fine.
Even at higher temperatures.
Even at higher temperatures.
So you're saying that in this case, the coral, and actually I did a show based on the movie Chasing Coral. I don't know if you saw it. Great. It's I mean, the time-lapse photography showing the devastation of the great, and the producer and director of the show was my guest, and he also did a show Chasing Ice.
Right.
So that was a precursor. It looked devastating to me. I mean, the time lapse showed these, beautiful coral, these animals flourishing, and then, a few years later, bleach.
And now you have to ask again what happened recently, right?
I will ask Jeff Orlowski if he's doing Chasing Coral 2.
Right, I'll send you the papers, all right? Okay, I mean, you should look at the research.
All right. I'd be fascinated. But certainly there
will be impacts. Of course there will.
And are that loss of those species that can't adapt, is that acceptable?
Look, it sounds kind of heartless to say that species come and go, but in fact that is the geological reality.
All right. Well, you're a scientist. How about the rate of species loss? Are we seeing an accelerated rate?
I don't know.
All right. That's your research assignment.
That absolutely.
You need to be able to answer that.
Unlike many people, I'm not afraid to say I don't know. Okay, that's the benefit of being a senior academic.
I am afraid. So.
All right.
All right. What do you see as the best strategies for reducing greenhouse gases? If Steve Koonin were king of the planet, what would you do? I mean, clearly you're for reduction.
I am for minimizing human influences on the planet. Yes, absolutely.
What would you do? Or what should we do?
Well, look, there's a balancing act, okay? And I have a deep sympathy for getting energy for the people who don't have it. And so I would put that as a higher priority. That's like the wolf at the door as opposed to worrying about your cholesterol a decade from now.
Or the wolf's cholesterol.
Or the wolf's cholesterol. Right. So I think we have to attend to that, and that's what you see India and China doing. Right? They're attending to their energy needs, perhaps giving lip service to the need to reduce emissions eventually.
I think you can drop the perhaps.
Yeah. For us in the developed world, remember we're only about 1.5 billion of the 8 billion people on the planet. I think we need to find a graceful way to decarbonize. Energy is provided by very complicated systems, and you can't just change one part of the system and expect it to still be reliable and economic for you. So, for example, everybody says wind and solar are the cheapest ways of generating electricity. That's true. Okay, the costs have gone down spectacularly, but the grid is a lot more than just generation. Most important for the grid is reliability. Right? 1 day out of a decade is the reliability standard. Right? And so the most expensive part of a renewable grid is in fact the reliability, and it will push the cost up by 3 times or something like that. Yeah? So I think, start pushing. Renewables are fine to a point. Reliability is going to go down at some point. We're going to have to provide backup, whether it's fission or whether it's batteries or some other form of storage or gas with carbon capture. And that's expensive. You've got to pay for that capability. The net result is that when people do estimates based on the real weather statistics across the country, we're going to wind up paying about 3 times as much for a high renewables grid as we have currently. Now, maybe we want to do that. Maybe we can develop technology to bring the cost down. I think that's very important. But we need to start thinking about this transition as a system and not just isolated technologies. while of course pushing the individual technologies as hard as we can.
All right, two quick questions. Certainly we're seeing, and as a physicist, you're seeing extraordinary advancements in battery technology, in lowering the cost, in a lot of new and different options, and in really the ability to create storage systems, often modular, that can provide electricity for a day, 2 days, 3 days. I mean, not for weeks and months.
You need weeks,
Well,
even with the best wide deployment of wind. There are times when the wind just doesn't blow for a week or two. And what are you going to do?
So, but most systems do depend on backup or primary natural gas,
Yep.
coals obviously being phased
Right.
out, nuclear, obviously.
Small nuclear.
So yeah, the SRC, the small nuclear reactors, talk a little bit about those, and would that technology be an ideal technology to export to countries where significant populations don't have electricity? Is that a great solution?
So when I was in the Department of Energy, we helped get started the first small modular reactor development programs. It's certainly a doable technology. We've been building small reactors in submarines for 70 years. Of course, these are not the same designs, but they have a heritage in them.
What's an SMR cost?
The hope is to get it down to a cost per megawatt that would be comparable to the big nuclear. So that's on the order of $10, $12 a watt, or you can do it per gigawatt, $12 billion for a gigawatt. But you don't build them in gigawatt scale. You build them in 50 or 100 megawatt scale. And the advantage is the design is the same for all of them. You know, for the nuclear plants we have now, the design is different for every one. And that makes tremendous regulatory and operating difficulties. You'd build these in a factory, they're identical. You put them on a flatbed truck or a barge and truck them to the site, and then install them successively on a single site. That helps with the financing also, because the cash flow from the first one helps to finance the second one, et cetera, et cetera. As you may know, one of the designs is now been submitted to the NRC for regulatory approval.
Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Yes, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for approval. One of the problems is you have to educate the NRC folks, because these are designs they're not used to. And so I think the government has provided some money for that to happen. And maybe we'll see one operating before the end of this decade.
And certainly that is a model that can be mass produced.
Absolutely.
And I would think serve many needs. What about, politically, your take on Americans' perspective on nuclear and our ignorance in regard to what other countries do with nuclear power? We still seem to be, because of 3 Mile Island. I was actually, when 3 Mile Island occurred, I was working at the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for the executive director, Bill McDonald, as a contractor, as a Beltway bandit. And he had been the executive director of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission before coming over to FERC. So he gave me a copy of the embargoed 3 Mile Island report before anyone else could see it. And I was fascinated by it. But we seem to be really more afraid than we should be of nuclear. Why is that? What can we do about that? Talk politics.
Right. Let me talk psychology first. Sure. So there's a wonderful book by a historian named Spencer Weir called Nuclear Fears. And it talks about the history of radiation, fission, nuclear weapons, and why people have such phobia about it, or many people do. And it's a combination of something you can't see, that's perceived to be threatening you, something that you have no control over, and of course the association with nuclear weapons. I think none of those fears are much justified in the modern world. We have ways of making proliferation-resistant designs. Nuclear power has a great operating record. And I think people just need to be educated. But what I can tell you is that if people do care about carbon emissions, nuclear's got to be a big part of the picture. And even environmental activists like Michael Schellenberger, Stuart Brandt from the Whole Earth Catalog, they become big proponents of nuclear power for that reason.
So obviously, operationally, nuclear power offers a zero carbon opportunity. How about though in the total life cycle? I think there's a little difference there.
No, small potatoes. This is an exercise I do with my students sometimes when I teach energy. So you can take all the concrete that's in a nuclear plant and the steel and so on and compare it with what the emissions would be from a coal plant, all right? And they're different by 2 orders of magnitude.
Advantage to nuclear.
Of course.
So from a financial perspective, one of the challenges with nuclear plants, and I'm not talking about the SMRs, the small modular reactors, but the more traditional plants. I mean, you're looking at projects, they're multi-billion-dollar projects. They have a track record of running way over budget. A utility will propose a $2 billion plant. Suddenly, as it's been under construction, it's $4 billion, then it's $8 billion. What's with that? And because of that, I think a lot of utilities, and certainly shareholders and regulators, they're reluctant to approve anything because they, the track record is this thing is going to cost 2 to 5 times what we're being told.
Yeah, and
ratepayers will be stuck with.
That's right, and that's all true. All right, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I will anyway. I would not urge anybody to do a big nuclear plant at this point in this country. China, different story perhaps. I think the way...
They don't have to worry about insurance premiums.
No, absolutely. Liability generally. I think the way forward is the smaller designs, and if somebody is thinking about going nuclear, I'd get on board with one of the small designs.
However, other countries are building new nuclear plants.
Okay.
Not many, though.
One of the problems with the nuclear industry is that we're all in this together. If there's an accident in China, then it will redound to regulation and a chilling of the industry here in the U.S.
All right. An area we talked about, but I don't want to. I'd like to go back to just a little bit is sea level rise.
All right. Okay.
Clearly, if you live in Florida, you're seeing things happen.
Well, it's funny you should mention that. All right. So
I'm not buying coastal property in Florida.
Well, but
would you?
Yes, of course.
Oh my God.
Well, I'd check the record, of course. But the president has bought, former President Obama has bought a beachfront property in Hawaii. Bill Gates.
Well, that's because Netflix gave him so much money he doesn't know what to do with it.
All right, but still, on the beach, if you really believe sea level is going to go up. So I gave a talk in Florida, in Jacksonville, about 2 months ago. Right? And of course, I'd like to do something local. So I looked up the tide gauge data for the nearest, turns out to be the Mayport Naval Air Station at the end of the river. And there's a nice record there for about 100 years. And I look in the local paper and it says, sea level is going up the fastest, here's the tide gauge data. But you go back 60 years, 50 years, it was going up fast and then it went down slowly and going up fast again, all having to do with the dynamics of the Gulf Stream, all right? And so again, there's this alarmism that the media emphasizes. When you look up the actual tide gauge data, and I'll use Miami Beach as an example, Virginia Key is right off of Miami Beach, it's going up steadily at 3 millimeters a year, which is what every other tide gauge is doing on the East Coast. So yes, Miami is in trouble, but it was flooding in the 1930s and it's sunk a little bit more since then. So let me tell you another sea level rise story.
Okay? Before you do, one aspect is it's certainly possible that current sea rise is due to climate change.
Well, some of it certainly is, absolutely. We're in an interglacial, the period between glaciations. The last interglacial was 125,000 years ago. The globe was 2 degrees warmer, and sea level was 6 meters higher than it is now, 20 feet. Okay? So the ocean goes up and down a lot by itself. The question is whether we've seen an acceleration due to human influences.
And how about ocean? So 2 other things. Yeah. And I know you have something you want to go back to.
Yeah.
But how about ocean temperature? I'd like you to talk about that. And one of the things that, my understanding, there's no dispute, is that we are carbonizing the ocean. The ocean is doing heavy lifting on behalf of mankind. And in fact, because of carbon markings, we can actually tell that carbonization, in terms of the ocean acidification, is being caused by human activity. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's fair. That's fair. We understand that. Look, the atmospheric rise in CO2, which is the precursor to it getting absorbed by the ocean, is unambiguously due to human activity. Absolutely. We have 4 or 5 lines of evidence that all point in the same direction. With respect to ocean temperature, the surfaces are getting warmer as the rest of the land is. But you know, the deep ocean is getting warmer, but very, very slowly. You know, we're talking hundredths of a degree changes per decade, and that's probably the surest indication that the planet is absorbing energy. You know, the amount of energy it absorbs is less than 1% of the total energy flowing through the system, so human influences are very small, but the planet is very sensitive to them. So very small changes in the ocean temperature as you go down in depth. Again, I'm not an expert and have not looked deeply into ocean acidification, so I'm not going to say much there other than to note that the pH changes we're talking about are at the few hundredths of a pH unit, and those are small compared to the variation from location to location or with the seasons.
But certainly as a scientist, you would agree it's possible that even though those changes are minuscule, for certain species they could have huge impact.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So what, you know, when you look at fishery issues, et cetera, and those are complex. I mean, it's easy to say, well, we're not catching as many lobsters. Actually, I think we're catching more, but
now.
That's another.
Yes,
that was a bad example, but you know, so whatever.
These things go in cycles. You know, Volterra was an Italian mathematician some number of centuries ago. He discovered predator-prey cycles, right? The predator eats most of the prey gets a chance to regrow, and then it all happens over again.
Well, the predator eats the prey. Right. There's very few prey.
Right.
The predator
dies, and
then
so on. Yes.
Right.
Good. Thank you.
Unless they ate all the prey.
Right.
So hopefully, but we pray that they don't eat all the prey.
Right.
But in that vein, how do we scientifically differentiate between, or can we? I mean, in some cases, maybe we can't, between, you know, what is cyclical, what's caused by us, and certainly on the ocean acidification front, we have the scientific.
We have the mechanism by which
say
it's happening.
that, oh my gosh, those carbon particles are from us.
And then the question is, what impact will it have, right, on the living system? Let me, you know,
we get what, 85% of our oxygen essentially from the ocean.
I wouldn't worry about that.
Yeah,
okay.
You're not worried about breathing?
No,
okay,
no.
all right. Well,
you know,
I'm reassured.
Look, I wouldn't worry about that. Okay, these changes we're talking about are small physically. They may have impact on calcium formation in shells of sea creatures, but we're not in danger of running out anytime soon. You know, oxygen is going down very, very slightly at the parts per million level because we're burning carbon and it needs to grab the oxygen and make CO2.
Hey, Steve, thanks so much for joining me. Chat with you. Hey, that was great. All right, that was NYU professor Stephen Koonin. I'm Aaron Harber. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.